So it's really my pleasure to introduce Professor Pascale Garaud from UC Santa Cruz, who will speak about waves, instabilities, and mixing in stars. Thank you, Pascale.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, everyone, for inviting me to this meeting. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, and I would have loved to see the ICTS. I'm also aware that it's kind of late for some of you, so thanks for being here for another hour. I can't actually see anyone on the setup I have, but I'll be monitoring the chat if you have any questions, so don't hesitate. So basically, I was asked by Thierry to give a broad lecture on the topics of the conference, with the understanding that most of you are not actually astrophysicists. So I'll be talking about waves, instabilities, and mixing in stars. And the first part of my talk is mostly just an introduction to the topic of stellar fluid dynamics in general, and what people studying the subject work with and are interested in. And then the second part of my talk, I'll dive into more detail about this particular topic that's been keeping me busy recently, namely shear instabilities in stars. So let's begin with a quick tour of stellar astrophysics. So stars are basically giant self-gravitating, rotating balls of plasma. And unless the rotation is very rapid, they are mostly spherically symmetric. And unless they are extremely massive, or at the end of their lives, they usually evolve very slowly, satisfying both hydrostatic and thermal equilibrium. And during that slow, quasi-steady evolution, we can write down these equations of stellar structure in one dimension, and they take the following form. The most important one is hydrostatic equilibrium, which you can recognize here, which basically is the balance between gravity, which pulls the fluid inwards, and pressure, which pushes it outwards. And the gravity is a function of the density in the star. And this is basically Newton's law of gravitation. And the pressure, on the other hand, is related to the density, temperature, and composition of the star using an equation of state. Now, the pressure is very high at the center because it's very hot at the center of the star, and it's very hot because the star is producing heat through nuclear fusion reactions. So there's another set of equations describing that. So there's a conservation law here relating the amount of energy produced by nuclear reactions in the star to the luminosity in a given spherical shell. And then there's an equation, of course, describing the nuclear reaction rates and how they depend on the local density, temperature, and composition in the star. And then finally, the last equation here is an equation for thermal equilibrium, which relates the local temperature gradient to the local heat flux, which is either carried by photon radiation if the star is convectively stable, so this is pictured here, or is carried by convection if the region is convectively unstable, which is pictured here. And so the formula will be different whether you're radiative or convective. And so in the sun, for example, the outer third by radius is convectively unstable, while the inner 2/3 is convectively stable, as in this picture. Now, I want to point out that in these equations, the ones in black here, here, and here are basically standard classical laws of conservation and basically hydrostatics. So the devil in the detail for stellar evolution basically lies in these green equations, the equation of state, the nuclear energy production rate, and the heat flux. So I'm not going to go into detail about what goes in there, but basically a lot of the microphysics and physics of turbulent convection go there. Also, the previous equations are basically those used to compute the stellar structure, but they depend on the user knowing what the composition of the star is at a function of radius. But the composition in practice evolves because of the nuclear reactions. So in stellar evolution codes, you usually have an additional equation that evolves the composition. And the right-hand side is going to depend on the nuclear reaction rates, as well as an advection term by large-scale flows and some turbulent mixing term. And the large-scale flows and the turbulence are themselves often assumed to depend on the rotation rate and the rotational shear in the star. So modern stellar evolution codes usually also have an evolution equation for the angular momentum of a given spherical shell. And the right-hand side depends again on the advection by large-scale flows and turbulent mixing. And so The issue here is that all of these equations are one-dimensional, so it's just a function of radius and time. And so the only way to include advection and turbulence in stellar evolution code is to have a simplified model for these processes. And this is where stellar fluid dynamicists like myself are asked to come up with these advection and turbulent mixing terms in a 1D model. And I'll talk about some of that in the second part of my talk. So with these stellar evolution models in hand, we actually now know, after 100 years of stellar evolution, we know quite a bit about stars, and a lot of it is summarized in this figure. So this is a Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, which shows the luminosity on the y-axis here against the color or the effective temperature of the star on the x-axis. More luminous stars are here, and the cooler stars are here, the redder ones, while the hotter stars, the bluer ones, are here. Now, this diagonal line in the diagram over here is called the main sequence, and this is where the stars spend most of their lives as they fuse hydrogen into helium into the core. Now, on the main sequence, the low mass stars are these ones over here, so they are less luminous and cooler, so that's why they appear redder. The high mass stars are over here, and so they're more luminous and bigger and bluer. So now the low mass stars are known to be fully convective. So there's a convection zone in the entire star. Intermediate mass stars like the sun have an inner region that's stably stratified and an outer region that's convective. And finally, the very giant stars have an inner convective region and an outer stably stratified region. Now, once a star has finished burning hydrogen in its core, it then leaves the main sequence and goes up this region over here, where it becomes what's called a red giant. So the envelope of the star expands a lot, and it becomes very luminous. The envelope is convective, and the star has a stably stratified core at this point. And beyond that, what happens to the star depends on stellar mass. But usually the evolution becomes extremely fast, and these assumptions are made of thermal equilibrium and hydrostatic equilibrium no longer apply. So most of what I've said so far was about stellar structure. So you may ask, what about stellar fluid dynamics? And so now I'm going to go into what we know about stellar fluid dynamics from observations, and more specifically helio and astroseismology. So for the longest time, stellar fluid dynamics was a bit of a non-issue because we couldn't really see the fluid flows inside stars. Certainly never in stars other than the sun, but even in the sun, we couldn't really see anything other than the surface flows. But things changed in the 1960s thanks to this chance discovery. So Layton et al. Discovered that the sun surface vibrates on a characteristic timescale of 5 minutes. So this is a 5-hour movie. Is it going to play it? Somehow it's not playing it. Oh, well, never mind. So you could see that there are oscillations on the surface. Every point here in black is a point that is receding away from you. And the points here in white are points that are moving towards you. And the origin of these vibrations was clarified about 10 years later by Ulrich in 1970. And he said that these are sound waves are excited by the convective motions, and they are trapped in an acoustic cavity between the surface where they're excited and some radius below, where the increasing temperature downwards is basically causing the waves to refract back towards the surface. So that makes the star oscillate at very specific frequencies. Ah, this movie is working. There we go. So this is a wave packet in the sun. Now, the stars being fluid bodies, they actually support many types of waves, not just pressure waves. So they support P modes, pressure waves, internal gravity waves, just like we have in the ocean, in the atmosphere, surface gravity waves, just like we have in the ocean, and Rossby waves, just like we have in the atmospheres. Now, which ones we see at the surface of the star is going to depend on the availability of an excitation mechanism. So if nothing can excite it, we're not going to see the wave. And whether modes can travel to the surface of the star, because that's the only place where they're visible. And finally, it's going to depend a lot on the resolution of the instrument. So for the sun, we have a very high spatial resolution, so we can see a lot of modes, where for other stars, we don't. We only see a point light pixel, and so we only see very, very low order modes. So for example, in the sun, we have both pressure modes and surface modes, and they're visible and excited by the convection. The surface convection zone, on the other hand, means that we can't have G modes here, and there might be G modes, gravity modes in the interior that's stably stratified, and these would be excited by convective plumes, but the detection at the surface is very difficult. So this is a diagram showing the observed acoustic power in color as a function of angular degree L. So think about the wave number associated with the spherical harmonic YLM, and a frequency here in nanohertz. So we see many ridges, the first of which corresponds to the surface wave, here the F mode. And all of these other ridges are pressure waves with different radial wave numbers. And each of these ridge, if you look at a more detailed spectrum, is further split into modes of different azimuthal wave number M, because the sun's rotating. Now, in other stars, there are several types of excitation mechanisms. And in fact, we continue to discover new ones with time. And so there's lots of different types of pulsating stars. And this is shown here. This is again an HR diagram with the luminosity against temperature. And this black line here is the main sequence I showed you earlier. So the sun is here and the red giant stars are up here. Now you see the solar type oscillators are right here, but there are many other ones. And we also see that there are different types of stars with different types of oscillations. The blue ones are stars that are oscillating with predominantly pressure modes at the surface, whereas the red ones are the way stars are oscillating with predominantly gravity modes at the surface. But one very big difference, like I said, with the sun is that because we only have information from 1 point pixel of light, we can only detect very low order modes. So that limits a lot what we can do with stellar pulsations. You see, the key about stellar pulsations is that waves with different wave numbers penetrate down to different depths, and so probe different parts of the star. The red one is a high wave number mode that penetrates only in a shallow way, whereas the green ones and blue ones have lower wave numbers and they penetrate much more deeply. And the frequency of oscillation we measure at the surface ends up being a weighted integral of some function of the sound speed and the rotation rate along the path of the wave. And so the frequency knows about where the wave has been and therefore is related to its wave number in this sense. And so there's a way to use inverse theory to reconstruct the internal stratification and rotation profile of the star from measured frequencies. And this is basically the subject of helio and astroseismology. And since that was discovered, these have basically been used as remote sensing tools for stellar fluid dynamics. And so just to give an example, one of the really great successes of helioseismology is that it's provided a way to validate solar physics. This is a figure here that shows the square of the sound speed as a function of radius. And it has both the solar model as a solid line and the solar observations using helioseismology as a dashed line. And I guess the point is you can't tell the difference with the naked eye between these two curves, which tells you how good the solar structure model, which is based on these equations I showed you earlier, how good it actually is. And by the way, this little bump here is marking the edge of the convection zone. So you can see it's at 0.7 solar radii with everything above it being fully convective. Now, more interesting for us doing the studying, rotating stratified fluids is that helioseismology can also tell us about large-scale fluid flows, and in particular, the angular velocity profile and the meridional flows. So on the left here, it shows the angular velocity profile in nanohertz in the interior of the sun, where this axis here is the pole, this is the equator, and this dashed line here is the base of the convection zone, and this is the surface. And you can see that the equator is rotating substantially more rapidly than the poles, at least in the convection zone. And then below that, the sun is rotating more or less uniformly in the stably stratified interior. On the right here, we see a tentative inversion for meridional flows in the solar convection zone. So we have, it's hard to see, but we have equatorward flow just below the surface, with a return flow about halfway through the convection zone, and then a second meridional cell under that. Note that there's still a lot of debate about this particular picture because the sensitivity of inversions to meridional flows is much less than the sensitivity of inversions to angular velocity. And then from astroseismology, as I mentioned earlier, we get a lot less information per star, but that's compensated by the fact that we have a lot of stars. And so we can get a statistical sense of the dynamical properties of stars. So it's basically quantity over quality in this case, but it's very valuable nevertheless. So for example, this picture shows measurements of the rotation in a series of stars at different stages of evolution. So the main sequence stars up here would be stars on the main sequence here. These subgiants are stars that have just left the main sequence, roughly here. The RGB stars are the red giant branch stars, which are up here. And finally, the second clump are stars that have started burning helium in their core and they're about here. And for each star, we have two symbols connected by a line. The triangle down here show the surface rotation rate of the star, and the circles up here show the core rotation rate of the star, which is usually larger a little bit. And so one thing we see immediately is that, other than these weirdos here, we have that the main sequence stars are rotating almost uniformly. The stars that are more evolved, on the other hand, are off the main sequence, have a significant amount of rotational shear between the core and the surface, with the core rotating up to 10 times faster than the surface. And so there are many more results from helio and astroseismology, as a lot of them on stellar structure. But I think this tour hopefully gave you a little bit of an idea about the kinds of observations we can know from these seismology measurements. So let me now talk about the connection between astro and geophysical fluid dynamics. So with all of this, it should be pretty clear that stars are fluid bodies with dynamics that have many similarities with the Earth's ocean and atmosphere. And in particular, they both contain convective and stable zones, so stably stratified zones. And rotation and stratification in both cases matter. Stars and the Earth both have large-scale meridional flows, so shown here for the Sun and here for the Earth's atmosphere. And they show an amount of differential rotation, again, here for the Sun, and in these easterlies and westerlies for the Earth's atmosphere, for example. And so with that, you quickly realize that the kinds of questions we ask in stellar fluid dynamics are actually very similar to those that we ask in atmospheric dynamics or in physical oceanography, which is presumably why I'm here. In particular, so the outstanding questions are important in both fields. There's many of them, of course, but I had to pick some of the most important ones. For convection, we're all very interested in finding out what the convective mixing efficiency is, especially when the system is rotating. And we're all also interested in finding out what is the turbulence or the plume-induced mixing beyond convective boundaries, so sometimes called entrainment or penetration or overshoot. Obviously, we know that there's waves in stars. We've just shown them to you. So big questions are, how are waves generated by convection? Wave-induced transport and mixing, in particular of chemical species, and wave-mean flow interaction, of course. And finally, in terms of instabilities in stratified fluids, we talk a lot about shear-induced turbulence, double diffusive turbulence, centrifugal turbulence, baroclinic turbulence, etc. So all of this is valid both in GFD and in AFD. These are the big questions. And an even bigger question, I think, that is central to the understanding of the atmosphere and ocean on Earth and in the dynamics of stars overall, is to figure out quantitatively how everything fits together. So how all of these boxes, the stratification, the waves, the turbulence, and the large-scale flow affect each other. Just to take an example that's relevant both on Earth and in stars that I'm going to talk about later, if I think about shear instabilities, say in a stably stratified region of a star or in the ocean, the shear comes from here, the stratification comes from here, and they drive the shear instability. But once the turbulence sets in, then that affects angular momentum transport, and it affects the temperature and compositional stratification. And there are similar connections between all these boxes in this diagram. So it's clear that we're all asking the same questions, and we have a lot to learn from each other between geophysics and astrophysics. But before we get too excited, there are actually a lot of differences as well between the Earth and the stars that we have to keep in mind. The first is that obviously stars don't have topography, but topography is really important on Earth. And the second is that magnetic fields don't really play a role in the Earth's atmosphere and ocean dynamics, but they really do in stars. And this is an image, for example, of a sunspot. Now, sunspot is a magnetic concentration that partially suppresses convection, which is why they appear dark. So this is where the effect of magnetic fields are really crucial, of course. And most importantly, and if there's one message you need to take out of this talk, is the fact that the Prandtl number in the Earth's atmosphere and oceans is really, really different from the Prandtl number in stars. So the Prandtl number is the ratio of the kinematic viscosity to the thermal diffusivity. And in the Earth's atmosphere and ocean, it's of order 1, a little bit larger than 1. But in stars, it's extremely small. And this is a figure that shows the Prandtl number as a function of radius in stars of different masses, from very low mass to very high mass stars. And you can see on the scale, it's never much bigger than 10 to the minus 5. So now we have a completely new parameter space to play with, which is this very low Prandtl number, asymptotically low Prandtl number turbulence regime. And that makes a big difference. All these differences that I talked about, they affect the driving and the connections between these key processes. In terms of the driving, a simple one is to think about topography. It plays a big role in generating waves in the ocean and in controlling where the large-scale meridional circulation goes, but it's clearly completely irrelevant for stars. So other things drive meridional flows in stars and waves. Similarly, the fact that the stars have a low Prandtl number, whereas the Earth has a high Prandtl number, has a big impact on all of these dynamical elements, to the extent that actually very little of what we know from geophysical fluid dynamics applies as is to stellar fluids. So it's important to study them separately. And so I'm going to start mentioning 2 very quick examples and then dig into the third one more comprehensively. So the first one is about the interaction between stratification and meridional flows on differential rotation. There's a well-known work by Barselden and Pedlowski in '67 who showed that in a rotating stratified fluid, the depth of penetration of a large-scale circulation is proportional to its horizontal extent, LH, times this factor here, which contains the Prandtl number, as well as omega over n, where omega is the rotation rate and n is the buoyancy frequency. Now, usually omega over n is very small. And so with the Prandtl number of order unity, this depth of penetration is really small compared to the horizontal extent of the meridional flows. But in stars, the Prandtl number being extremely small, the depth of penetration can actually be very, very much comparable to the horizontal extent of the meridional flows, meaning that meridional flows can, in some cases, penetrate very deeply into the star. So here, the fact that the Prandtl number is very small makes a big difference in the outcome. Another example where the Prandtl number matters is in double diffusive instabilities and the turbulence they generate. Double diffusive instabilities are instabilities of stably stratified fluids that have a temperature stratification in color and a chemical stratification that is, you can see in the density of dots. And they take place either when temperature is stably stratified and composition is unstably stratified, like here, or in the opposite situation. Now, on Earth, this happens with salt being the composition, whereas in stars, it happens with helium being the composition. And I'm not sure that any geophysicist would ever claim that double diffusive instabilities are crucial to the Earth's dynamics. But in stars, on the other hand, because the low Prandtl number, it turns out that these instabilities are both almost ubiquitous. You'll find them everywhere. And they're also quite important for chemical mixing. And so this is a second example where low Prandtl number makes a big difference. And if you want to know more, I invite you to look at this review in Annual Review of Fluid Mechanics that talks about low Prandtl number double diffusive instabilities. And so the last one I want to talk about, and I'm going to talk about it in much more depth now, is the question of shear instabilities at low Prandtl number. And again, I'm going to show that a low Prandtl number makes a huge difference in the instability of stratified shear flows. And in this part of the talk, I'll now be a little bit more technical, and I'll focus on this particular question. But before, maybe if there's any questions, any super quick question, I can take that if you have a question on the first part of the talk. I'm not hearing anyone, so presumably not. Okay. All right, so we already saw plenty of evidence for shear in stars. So shear in the radial direction, you can see here, for example, and here in these stars that have a strong rotational shear between the core and the envelope, but also, and you can sort of see it a little bit here, shear in the horizontal direction. In the stably stratified region of the sun here, there's a little bit of horizontal shear as well, and similarly in other stars. And these shear instabilities have long been proposed to be the source of mixing in stars. And the big question is, how much mixing do they actually cause? In other words, can we quantify turbulent transport of momentum and buoyancy by shear instabilities in stars, so at low Prandtl? And also an interesting question is, how does this differ from transport in geophysical fluid dynamics? So just to take a step back, the standard criterion for shear instabilities in stratified shear flows that are non-dissipative, so without thermal diffusion or viscosity. That was derived by Miles and Howard in 1961. And it states that a necessary condition for instability in this non-dissipative flows is that the Richardson number, J, which is the ratio of the buoyancy frequency squared to the shearing rate squared, should drop below a quarter somewhere in the fluid. And a physical interpretation of this criterion is that if you consider two fluid elements here and here in a stratified fluid, and these are flowing at different velocities, and then through some mixing event, unspecified, we equalize both their densities and their velocities, and their momenta, sorry. Then that mixing is associated with a kinetic energy gain from mixing the momenta and a potential energy lost from mixing the densities. And the ratio of the potential energy cost to the kinetic energy gain, you can easily show that it's proportional to the Richardson number with a constant of a proportionality of order 1. And that tells us that the instability is only possible if the cost is smaller than the gain, therefore, if the Richardson number is smaller than the quantity that's of order 1. So that's kind of the basic physical interpretation of this criterion. Now in stars, you can actually use the observation I showed you together with stellar models to get the buoyancy frequency. And then we find that for the solar tachocline, the Richardson number is actually of order of 1,000 here at most, and usually much less than that. And in these older evolved stars, it's closer to being 1,000,000. So that would suggest that shear instabilities are completely ruled out in stars. But actually, it's not the case for two reasons. The first one is thermal diffusion, and the second one is horizontal shear. And I'm going to talk about them in turn. So let's recall that the Richardson criterion I just showed you, it assumes that the fluid motion is adiabatic. So, and that's why the vertical motion, the mixing of the density, has a large potential energy cost. But thermal diffusion reduces the buoyancy if you're thermally stratified and your density fluctuations are proportional to the temperature fluctuations. So thermal diffusion reduces the temperature fluctuation and therefore reduces the potential energy cost. And with that, it can promote instability. So there's little to no potential energy cost. And so it's much easier if you're thermally diffusive to get some mixing from shear instabilities in stars. And to see this a little bit more quantitatively, let's look at the advection diffusion equation for temperature here. Now, dimensionally, the ratio of the advection term to the diffusion term, you can estimate it, and you find that it's equal to the RMS velocity of the flow times a typical scale of the eddies divided by the thermal diffusivity. And this number, which looks a lot like a Reynolds number, is called the Pascale number. And so, similar to a Reynolds number, thermal diffusion is going to be negligible when the Pascale number is extremely large, while thermal diffusion is going to be really important when that Pascale number is of order 1 or much smaller than 1. And that happens, as you can see here, when you either have very slow flows, so you have time to do thermal diffusion, or where you have very small eddies, so the thermal diffusion is really fast. And note that, so this is the relationship between the Pascale and the Prandtl number. You can see that Pascale is basically Prandtl times Reynolds. And it's easy to remember because it's a contraction of these two symbols. PE is PRRE, right? And because the Pascale is equal to Prandtl times Reynolds, we see that the limit of strong thermal diffusion is not relevant for shear instabilities in geophysics. Because when the Prandtl number is of order 1, then the Pascale number is of order Reynolds number. And so to have a very small Pascale number for thermal diffusion to be important, you also have to have a small Reynolds number, and in which case shear instabilities cannot take place. But in stars, on the other hand, the Prandtl number is very, very small. So it's possible to have a very small Pascale number as well as a very large Reynolds number at the same time. And so these are ideal conditions for the development of what we call diffusive shear instabilities. And it's really unique to stellar interior conditions. So let's dig a bit deeper into this low Pascale number, high Reynolds number limits, because it has a lot of interesting properties. So we're going to assume that the temperature is given by some background temperature that's linearly stratified, so it has a constant stratification, plus some perturbations. And then we're going to non-dimensionalize everything using the RMS velocity of the turbulence as an estimate of the velocity, the eddy scale as an estimate of the distance, and L times dt dz as an estimate of the temperature scale. And with these units, we get the non-dimensional temperature equation that looks like that. And I've also separated T bar from T twiddle. And so in this equation, this term, U dog rad T tilde, is the advection of the fluctuations, whereas this one is the advection of the background stratification. And then we see that the Pascale number I defined earlier appears here in front of the temperature diffusion term. Now, with this, and this was shown by François Linière in '99, you can actually do an asymptotic expansion of the equations and use asymptotic analysis to derive a reduced model for heat transport in the limit of low Pascale number. And so you can create an asymptotic series for temperature in the Pascale number, as well as for the velocity field. And plug these asymptotic series into the advection diffusion equation I showed you earlier. And this is the result. And I have color coded the various terms to show those of the same order and the same color. And the largest term is the one in 1 over Pascale. Remember, Pascale is very small. And you can see that this one is unbalanced. So that immediately tells you that the grad squared of the 0th order temperature is 0, which with appropriate boundary conditions actually tells us that this background, the 0th order temperature fluctuations are 0. And so going back here, it tells us that the temperature fluctuations must be of order Pascale, so they're always really small. And so then this means that this term here disappears, or at least it comes out at a higher order. And at the next order, we're just left with a balance between these two terms, namely the advection of the background stratification and the diffusion of the temperature fluctuations. So, or in other words, rewritten like here. And so this shows that the vertical velocity and the temperature fluctuations are really intimately connected in here, right? So these terms here are completely negligible, and you just have a balance between W and 1 over P grad square T tilde. So instead of solving an evolution equation for temperature, we can actually just solve for temperature if we know the vertical velocity here. And that is true instantaneously. And note that we have used direct numerical simulations to test that solving the full equations and solving this reduced equation gives the same result, provided the Peclet number is indeed small. There's an issue here that we always must keep in mind, though, is that if you want to use this model, or if you want to use this reduced equation to model turbulence in stars, is that we don't actually know ahead of time what the emergent turbulent velocity URMS and the eddy length scale is for a given system. So we need to be very careful when using this equation a priori. We must always do a self-consistency check to make sure that it works a posteriori as well. But assuming that it works, you can then go back to the dimensional equations, which are written here. And so this is what it is, right? That's the advection of the background stratification and the diffusion of the fluctuations. And if I divide by the thermal diffusivity kappa T, you can now see that this parameter group always has to appear together in this low Peclet number limit. So at low Peclet number, and I'm going to write this in red because it's really important, the parameters associated with the temperature gradient and the thermal diffusivity always appear together as this ratio. So you can either write it like this, or because dt dz is what actually sets the buoyancy frequency, you can write it as n squared over kappa T. And the first thing you can immediately then see is that the standard Richardson criterion is not going to be applicable at low Peclet number, because that's what the standard Richardson criterion look like. And we do not see any kappa T here. So that cannot be the right criterion at low Peclet number. So let's now look at vertical shear instabilities in stars in the low Peclet number limit. And before I do that, I'm just going to ask, are stars in the low Peclet number regime? And the answer is a bit difficult because, like I said, the Peclet number depends on the emergent scale of turbulence, which is hard to predict a priori, right? And we can't observe it in stars. But we also know that vertical shear instabilities wouldn't exist in the first place if we were not in the low Peclet number regime. So we can sort of play the devil's advocate and assume that the stars are low Peclet number. And that being the case, we can use the low Peclet number equations to study vertical shear instabilities in the diffusive limit and then check for consistency later. So in this field, everything pretty much started with the works of Jean-Paul Zahn in 1974 and 1992, where he effectively laid out the foundations for low Peclet number shear instabilities. And so given a stratified fluid at low Peclet number, with a stratification characterized by a buoyancy frequency, background shear S, and a viscosity nu, thermal diffusivity kappa T, he basically argued through a number of different ways, all leading to the same conclusion effectively, that in the low Peclet number limit, the correct criterion isn't the Richardson criterion, but instead it's the product of the Richardson number times the Prandtl number that has to be smaller than a quantity of order 10 to the minus 3. He also argued that the vertical scale of the turbulent eddies should scale like this, so kappa T S over n squared, square root of that. And that the turbulent diffusivity is basically the shearing rate times this length squared. That's just dimensional analysis. And so that would be kappa T S squared over n squared. And note how in all of these model predictions, you always see the ratio n squared over kappa T appear together, here, 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 which is consistent with what I just said about the low Peclet equations that require this to always appear as a ratio. And in fact, it's not very difficult to see that, for example, this length scale is the only length scale you can construct from these values together with the fact that n squared and kappa t must appear together. And similarly for the turbulent diffusivity. So you could have redone all of this stuff using just dimensional analysis effectively. So a little while ago, we went about to test this model for stratified shear instabilities at low Pecklin number. And in this particular paper here, we looked at a stratified plane couette flow at low Pecklin number. And we studied the resulting turbulence as a function of, say, Reynolds number, Pecklin number, and stratification. And the first thing we checked is whether the stability criterion proposed by Jean-Paul Zahn is correct. So to do that, we basically started from weakly stratified turbulent solutions that can be obtained very easily, and progressively increased the stratification in the simulation by increasing the Richardson number, say, until the turbulence just dies away. And this diagram shows the resulting vertical RMS velocity squared, so an estimate of the vertical kinetic energy, as a function of Richardson Prandtl for simulations at different Reynolds numbers here in the colors, with the highest Reynolds number being the orange one. And you can see that the data shows a bifurcation when Richardson Prandtl is about 0.007, irrespective of the Reynolds number. Above this value, the turbulence completely dies away. So this tells us that a stability criterion for vertical shear instabilities in this low Pecklin number limit is that the Richardson times the Prandtl number should be smaller than 0.007. So that completely validates Jean-Paul's model and actually provides an estimate for that threshold value. And even more remarkably, the same threshold was found in lots of different other studies by our group and other groups. So for, say, Kolmogorov flow, shearing box simulations, showing that this is really a universal result. And so this is the first of these tested, and that's indeed true for vertical shear instabilities at low Pecklin number. And you'll just have to take my words that we checked that the other two are also correct, as long as we're far from this instability threshold here. So everything seems to work out quite well, and we're able to show that these vertical diffusive shear instabilities exist and satisfy this model. And so now, provided everything works out in terms of the self-consistency check I showed you earlier, we can in principle use this as a model for turbulent mixing in stars for vertical shear instabilities. But after all this work, it turns out that these instabilities are not actually relevant for stars because, or not very relevant, let's be more moderate. So even with this new diffusive criterion, as it turns out, the vertical shear in most stars will still be stable. So as Richardson Prandtl smaller than 0.007, with Prandtl number 10 to the minus 6, that would still require a Richardson number to be smaller than 10 to the 4. But we just saw earlier that the one in the tachocline might be about this size, but the one in the red giant branch star is another 2 orders of magnitude larger. So these red giant branch stars are not unstable to these vertical shear instabilities. And then even if the criterion is satisfied, the vertical mixing is not actually very efficient. And we estimated this, and you can see something to this effect in this review in Physical Review Fluid. So the diffusive shear instabilities exist, but they're not a significant source of mixing in stars. Which brings me to the last topic, which is horizontal shear instabilities in stars. So all stars are expected to have some weak level of horizontal shear in the stably stratified regions. And the horizontal shear is nice because it's not, the horizontal shear instabilities are not directly affected by the stratification because they drive primarily two-dimensional fluctuations, right, in the horizontal. But because these fluctuations are horizontal, they don't a priori cause any vertical transport. So if there's any vertical mixing, it must be caused by secondary instabilities. And so in '92, Jean-Paul Zahn proposed another model for turbulent mixing, this time for horizontal shear instabilities. So he started by assuming there is a horizontal flow with typical scale U and typical velocity scale U and horizontal scale L. And that this flow drives some kind of two-dimensional turbulence. Now, with the strong stratification and the low viscosity, he then assumed that this two-dimensional turbulence would decouple in the vertical direction, like that, and that would create a strong vertical shear, which combined with a high thermal diffusivity would then drive vertical shear instabilities when that criterion, Richardson-Prandtl, is smaller than 0.007, becomes satisfied. And crucially, you can see again that his argument is a low Peclet number argument. And so he proposed, again, a model, this time for the vertical eddy scale and the turbulent diffusivity for horizontal shear instabilities. And the vertical eddy scale is given by this quantity here, and the turbulent diffusivity is given by this quantity here. And without going into the details, you can see that in both cases, indeed, we have this ratio n squared over kappa t, which tells you indeed that his argument relies on this low Peclet number balance at the small vertical scales. And this time we need to be really careful, because it's completely not obvious that the emergent scale, the scale of these vertical eddies would end up being small enough for this to be true. Because if you compute a Peclet number based on the large horizontal scales, so the large scale horizontal flow velocity and size, you get a Peclet number of order 10 to the 7. And so that's many, many, many orders of magnitude larger than 1. And so assuming that these horizontal shear instabilities would end up creating vertical scales that are sufficiently small for the emergent Peclet number to be smaller than 1, that's a big leap of faith that needs to be checked. And so we went out again to test his model. This time we used a stratified Kolmogorov flow. So this is a stratified fluid, and the flow is driven by a sinusoidal body force that's pointing in the horizontal direction. Now, these are the non-dimensional equations that we're solving, and everything has been non-dimensionalized based on the anticipated amplitude and scale of the large scale horizontal flow. So we see these horizontal Reynolds number, horizontal Peclet number, and a stratification parameter here appear. And the stratification parameter is essentially the inverse of the square root of Freud number, if you like to think in terms of this quantity. So these are some sample results of the simulations. And qualitatively speaking, the model, the idea of Jean Pauzin seems to work very well. These figures show the streamwise flow velocity here in the top and the vertical flow velocity here in the bottom. For a large horizontal Reynolds number and horizontal Peclet number of 660 respectively. And the left column shows a moderately stratified flow, and the right column shows a strongly stratified flow. And so we see that as the instability proceeds, these streamwise flows develop some meandering horizontal jets. And these jets indeed decouple in the vertical direction. You can see they're not aligned in the vertical. And this vertical shear then becomes unstable, which drives vertical mixing, which we can see here in these two plots. And we also see, comparing the left and the right columns, so increasing the stratification, that the jets become shallower and the vertical eddies become shallower as the stratification increases. And that's exactly as he predicted. So qualitatively speaking, the idea is correct. So to test the model more quantitatively, we then focused instead on predictions for the turbulent diffusivity. So when written in terms of the units that I just used for these simulations, his prediction says that the turbulent diffusivity should go like the stratification parameter times the Peclet number to the -1/2, independently of the Prandtl number and independently of the Reynolds number. So does this work? And here's the data. It's for many different simulations. So the symbols, so this is the turbulent viscosity, the turbulent mixing coefficient as a function of this combination of parameters, stratification times Peclet. So these are different Reynolds numbers here. And in the colors, we have different Prandtl numbers. And if the model were to be true, then everything should have collapsed on a single line with a slope of -1/2 over here, right? And this is clearly not the case. So what's going on? Well, in order to figure out what's going on, we first tested that original assumption that the emergent turbulence should have a low Pascale number. And here we mean the turbulence based on the vertical scales. So we created a Pascale number based on the vertical RMS velocity, the vertical eddy scale, and the thermal diffusivity. And in this diagram, which is the same as before, the field symbols all have a large emergent Pascale number, whereas the open symbols all have a low emergent Pascale number. And so you can see that Zahn's model actually does work very well to explain the low Pascale number data. But on the other hand, it doesn't to explain the high Pascale number data. So that sort of suggests that indeed it works in the limits where it should work. But now that begs the question of what happens over here. And after a little bit of work, we discovered that the high Pascale number, so for simulations where the emergent Pascale number is high, then the data satisfies a different scaling law where the turbulent diffusivity goes like b to the -2/3. And this time it's independent of both Reynolds number and Pascale number, which makes sense. If the turbulence is non-diffusive, then it shouldn't know about either of these parameters. And to summarize many results, which I don't really have time to get into, but you can read about in these two papers, we find that horizontal shear instabilities at low Prandtl number have many different possible regimes, depending on the Pascale number of the observed horizontal large-scale flow and the buoyancy parameter, the stratification parameter based on these large horizontal flow. And the main distinction is whether the turbulence has a high or low emergent Pascale number. So this is a regime diagram for very low Prandtl number appropriate of stellar interiors. And in this corner down here, where the stratification is very strong, then the vertical eddy size is very small and the emergent Pascale number is indeed smaller than 1. And in this regime here, the turbulence satisfies Zahn's model for horizontal shear instabilities with scalings exactly as he predicted. On the other hand, when the stratification is relatively weaker, then we enter a completely new regime where the turbulent diffusivity and the vertical eddy scale in a different way from Zahn's model. And ironically, this is the regime where we think that the sun is at least just below the base of the convection zone. And it's worth noting that none of these scalings, to my knowledge, recover what we have in high Prandtl number geophysical turbulence. And it's obvious in the thermally diffusive case, because that regime just doesn't exist, but it's also true in the high Pascale number regime, because in geophysical turbulence, so high Prandtl number turbulence, there's a well-known result that the vertical eddy scale goes like U over N, and that's Froude number times the horizontal scale of the eddies. And here instead, we find that the vertical eddy scales goes like the Froude number to the 2/3 times the horizontal scale of the eddies. Now, that doesn't seem to be a big difference, but it really begs the question of why is it different? And it makes me worry sometimes that there's yet another regime in stars that we haven't discovered yet that might exist at even higher Reynolds and Pascale number, where this time we would recover the geophysical scaling, maybe. So to conclude this section, overall, I think we find that the scaling laws for transport by vertical and horizontal stratified shear instabilities are quite different from the geophysical case. And to circle back to stars, and we can now see what the implications for the sun are. And we can estimate from the models that we just created that the turbulent viscosity or the turbulent diffusivity due to horizontal shear instabilities of order 10 to the 11 centimeters squared per second, whereas the one due to vertical shear instabilities would be of order 10 to the 4 centimeters squared per second. And so you can see that horizontal shear instabilities are far more important for stellar mixing than the vertical shear instabilities. And that turns out to be true for most stars. So I'm going to wrap up. I have a few take-home messages for everybody. The first is that helio and astroseismic observations are telling us that stellar fluid dynamics are as interesting and complex as geophysical fluid dynamics. That having a low Prandtl number has a major impact on all aspects of fluid dynamics. And I gave you 3 examples: meridional flows, double diffusive instabilities, and shear instabilities. But of course, there's many other interesting problems to look at that I haven't even began to look at. And I didn't even bring up magnetic fields yet, which is another big issue in stellar fluids, of course. So that's it, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Pascale. I think it was an extremely well-prepared talk, very pedagogical. Thank you. I think it was also a great tribute to Jean-Paul Zahn, a great physicist and great astrophysicist, and I think it was also very good from that point of view. Is there any question?
Is anybody still here?
Yes, I think so. Just look, Noe is saying that it was very enriching for a non-astrophysicist. So great. I think it's true. Any question? I will start with one. Is there any hope to perform experiments on Earth? You discussed the problem of the dissipation and for the order of magnitude for the Reynolds number and the Beckley number. Is there any attempt on Earth to do experiments?
Well, I mean, it's a really good question. I think on Earth, we can go maybe as low as 10 to the minus 2 in Prandtl number with some really nasty fluids. I would have to check what our regime diagram predicts for Prandtl number 10 to the minus 2, and to see whether we could actually see a difference, a marked difference for geophysical fluids. I do think we should be able to get something in the sort of intermediate regime between this diffusive instabilities and non-diffusive instabilities. We should be able to probe that sort of area. The difficulty is that you really need a very tiny Prandtl number in order to have wiggle room, because you want to be very thermal diffusive without being viscous at all, right? And so you need that huge separation between the two. So I'm not sure if 10 to the minus 2 is low enough. Would have to check.
Okay.
But DNS are great. DNS work.
I have a question, Thierry, Pascale.
Go ahead, Mani.
So for defining the Prandtl number, is the anisotropy in the diffusivity of momentum, is that a factor?
I have never taken that into account. Are you meaning for plasmas in general?
For example, in the ocean, if the vertical and horizontal diffusivities are quite different.
Oh, so you're already thinking of a turbulent diffusivity when you make that statement, right? I'm
Yes.
using microscopic diffusivity, so not turbulent diffusivities. The turbulent diffusivities are emergent properties. Well, the one I defined is the microscopic one, just based on molecular collisions and photon radiation, basically.
Okay.
And that's why they're so different. You know, I think if we were to compute an effective Prandtl number based on the emergent turbulent, it wouldn't be anywhere near as small. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question from Dimitar. Have I considered the effect of spherical geometry on the horizontal shear instability? And the quick answer is sort of. The geometry itself isn't such a big deal. It's the rotation that's a big deal. So when you start being in a rotating spherical shell, the rotation can stabilize the shear instability. And that, I considered that a very long time ago in a 2D model, but I've never done this in 3D DNS. And I think that will be a big effect, because of course that's an additional stabilizing process, you know, for especially for the sun. It's quite, for example, the horizontal shear just below the base of the convection zone in the sun is just marginally stable to horizontal shear instabilities because of the rotation. And even and further below, it would be completely stable. So yes and no is the answer to your question.
Okay, I think Dimitar is happy. Is there any question? Okay, so I'm sure your talk has opened some perspectives to some of the participants. And thank you again, Pascale. And actually, I would like to thank the 4 speakers of the afternoon session or the evening session or the morning session, depends where you are. So thank you to Héloïse Meheux, Aurélie Astoul, Triantafylos Aquilas, and yourself, Pascale. And this is the end of the 3rd day of the conference, and we meet tomorrow, I think, with Dheeraj Varma. Thank you very much.